Y'all
all right? Yeah. We're going to elevate your frequency tonight because you are now enrolled in Kemet in the Desert University. Kemet means black, and the black of the college, the sweet of the knowledge, baby. Let's get ready to rumble. Bringing in the keynote speakers procession, Ole BC, Brother Husani, drum ensemble. Give it up for the brother. Come on. Have a seat, brother. Have a seat. Have a seat. Cool.
And presenting to you, Dr. Anthony Tony Browder. Woo! Wait now, there's more. So he is an author, publisher, cultural historian, artist, and an educational consultant. He is a graduate of Howard University's College Fine Arts, HU.
You know.
And he has lectured intensely throughout the United States, Africa, Caribbean, Mexico, Japan, and Europe on issues related to African and African American history and culture. Dr. Browder is the founder and the director of IKG Cultural Resources and has devoted over 30 years researching ancient Egyptian history, science, philosophy, and culture. He has traveled to Egypt over 54 times since 1980 and is currently the director of the ASA Restoration Projects, which is funding the excavation and restoration of the 25th dynasty tomb of Karakoum in Luxor, Egypt. Dr. Browder is the only African American to fund and coordinate an archaeological dig in Egypt and has conducted over 23 archaeological missions to Egypt since 2009. He is the executive producer of Global Assignment, a documentary of the life and times of Runoko Rashido, Dr. Runoko Rashidi. Brothers and sisters, please let's give a warm welcome, Kemet in the Desert, to our brother, Dr. Anthony Tony Browder. Ashe, Ashe, Ashe-o.
Thanks, sis. Thank you.
Dr. Browder.
Yes, sir.
Before you start your lecture today, each year, Kemet in the Desert series selects the Franklin G's Proclamation honoree. And tonight, you are the recipient of the Las Vegas City Proclamation. And to give you the proclamation is the newly elected City Councilwoman, Chandra Summers Armstrong.
Can I get a hug?
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you so much, sis. Appreciate you.
Thank you. Good evening. It's wonderful to be here. It's been quite the day, but I'm really, really just honored to be here. I knew Mr. Franklin G. Verley. I heard him on the radio one day at KCEP, and I thought, oh my gosh, who is this person? And I had the opportunity to meet him and to be able to give you a proclamation in honor of the wisdom and the knowledge that he bestowed upon our community from a different perspective that I had never heard before is really a blessing. And I thank you so much for the work that you do The young lady, Daisha, said all the things that are in the proclamation, so I will not reread it. But I just want you to know that as a city councilwoman for Ward 5, what you bring to Kemet in the Desert, what you bring to as knowledge for our community, the pride, the knowledge, the hope that you share with your teachings is beyond measure. And I'm very, very grateful to be here to present you with the proclamation from the city of Las Vegas. They're signed by the mayor and all members of the city council. So congratulations and thank you.
Thank you.
It's a Kodak moment, right this way. Las Vegas, today is Dr. Anthony Tony Browder's day in Las Vegas.
Thank you so much. I appreciate the honor, and I'm always humbled to be acknowledged by people who matter to me. You know, this work is work that oftentimes is not acknowledged by the people that you want to be the recipients of this information. Typically, it's sad, but it's true. Typically, people don't acknowledge you for the work that you do until you're buried and can no longer hear the good words that they shower upon you. So I am pleased to be the recipient of this award. And I pledge to you that I will continue to do everything within my power to earn the honor that you have bestowed upon me. And to be quite honest with you, you ain't seen nothing yet. I got some stuff. We got some stuff in the works that's going to move things to the next level. And I'm all about improving. I'm all about upgrading and doing what I do better, because if I'm doing today the same things that I did 2 years ago, 5 years ago, then something's wrong with me. Life is about growth. And as we grow, as we evolve, as we learn, we should be constantly upgrading and improving ourselves. And if we're not doing that, if we're stuck, then there's something wrong with us. Life is a continuum. And as I said yesterday on the radio, one of the radio interviews I did, that I'm a lifetime learner. I don't know everything. I never will know everything, but I know enough to know that I don't know everything, and I'm going to strive to learn as much as I can as long as I'm living. So that's my commitment to myself and my family. And I always believe in honoring my commitments. So can you turn the house lights up for a second just so I can do a real quick survey? How many of you all were not here yesterday? Okay, so about a little bit more, about 63%. Okay, so let me do a couple of things today that I did yesterday, just so that we can have some continuity with the audience. Yesterday, we screened a documentary that I produced on the Life and Times global assignment, The Life and Times of Dr. Runoko Rashidi. Runoko was one of the first participants in the Kemet in the Desert program, and was a brother who traveled worldwide to over 134 countries and passed suddenly as he was about to begin a trip to Egypt on August the 2nd, 2021. So his death, of course, came as a shock to everyone who knew him and loved him. And one of the things that we did in order to amplify his presence in the world was to produce this documentary. So I encourage you all who weren't here last night and didn't see the documentary, I want to let you know that the documentary is available for you to see online. I'll give you details on how you can do that. But I also shared with the audience last night that the Runoko Rashidi Foundation, his family, had produced this incredible calendar. Each page of the 12 months has a photograph of Runoko in one of his locations during his travels. This calendar is available for sale at the table out front. It was originally $30. Now that we're a third into the new year, the calendar has been marked down to $20. This is a keepsake, folks. So there are certain things that you should have in your library that you pass down to your children and grandchildren. So don't miss opportunities to be a part of history when history presents itself to you. The other thing I want to share with you is something that I discussed briefly yesterday before I introduced the film, and that is I want to illustrate very briefly why I'm honored to receive this proclamation from the city, and why I do the things that I do, why Runoko did the things that he did, and why so many of my colleagues invest their time, their talent, and their treasure doing this work, because we have to work overtime to correct the misinterpretations of his story. And I have this scroll, I have this timeline that I like to share with you all to frame what I'm going to be talking about this evening. And so just as I did yesterday, I'd like to invite 6 brothers to come up and help me illustrate this timeline. 6 brothers, come on up. You don't have to raise your hands, just 6. Come on up, stairs are right over there. And I'd like for you all to line up in a straight line so that I can very quickly run us through. I need 4 more brothers, 3 more brothers. Don't be ashamed. Don't be shy. Brother, come on up. You know you want to come up. Come on up. Come on. I see you got that smile on your face. You want to come on up. Come on. So this is my 6 right here. All right. So just space yourselves out and line up. This will be your line right here. So line up on this line. Toes on that line. Toes on that line. So let me start here at the end and unfurl this timeline, the scroll, hold it at the top and the bottom so that it's straight and everybody can see it. Slide down a little bit. All right. So this is the timeline that a colleague of mine from the UK developed. He was a high school history teacher. And in order to get his young folk engaged in history, he had to think outside of the box and find creative ways to put history in a different historical context. So over the course of about 15 years, he and I worked to develop this timeline, and this is the latest version of the timeline. And what it shows you is approximately 8,000 years of African history, beginning in 620 BC, going all the way down to 1,000 years into the future. The whole purpose of studying history is to understand the examples of life that preceded you. You study those examples because you know history repeats itself. So if you understand the cycles in history, then you should be able to understand where you are in a cycle, the circumstances that help to create the circumstances that you're confronted with now, so that you know what to do in order to prepare yourself for the next wave in that cycle. Does that make sense? I mean, that's what historically conscious people do. So what we did with this timeline is to lay out documented facts. I only talk about what I know. I don't talk about what I think. I don't talk about what I feel. I talk about things that can be proven, because we don't have to make things up if we're standing on a foundation of solid facts. So we have a host of facts that documented specific aspects of African history. And then we focus primarily on Kemet, because here in 332 BC is the beginning of the foundation of Kemet. Kemet is the oldest documented civilization known to mankind. I'll be talking more about Kemet in my presentation. I just want to run through this very quickly. So we show the beginning of the first nation state in the world. We show you images of the people responsible for creating culture and civilization and writing and philosophy and architecture and engineering, so that you can see who these people were. And the images that we have here on this timeline of the people who created these incredible human accomplishments are different than the images that you may see on National Geographic or Discovery Channel. So we need to understand that history is exactly what the word implies, his story. Whenever someone tells their story, they tell it to their advantage and to the disadvantage of the people who are often written out of history. So this is our story, if you will. So we move into the period of great architecture. We have here the step pyramid, the first man-made structure of stone. We have the image of the person who was responsible for creating that structure. We have the pyramids at Giza and the personalities responsible for overseeing the construction of those structures. And you can see very clearly from the timeline that you're looking at people who look like the same person who stares back at you when you look in the mirror. All right? It can't be more simpler than that. So we show you all of these images, and then we give you some historical context. We show you as we come down the timeline, this point here, 832 BC. 832 BC is when Homer, the first European writer of note, wrote the Iliad and the Odyssey. So European literature begins here on the timeline, 832 BC, thousands of years after documented African historical writings. Context is everything. The next point on the timeline I want to point out is 753 BC. 753 was when Romulus and Remus founded the city of Rome. So you have right here on the timeline the beginning of Greco-Roman culture and civilization, i.e. the beginning of European history and culture is right here on the timeline, thousands of years after documented African history. The most important part of the timeline that is relevant to us, specifically people of African ancestry, is this little period here in blue, which spans from 1444 to 1888. This is the period of the European enslavement of African people. So, in this country, when they talk about black history, this is where they begin our story right here, at the lowest point of human activity. So what I'm saying is, know yourself and know that our story doesn't begin at the lowest point. It begins all the way back here and beyond. So what we do, what Renoko did, what so many other scholars have done in the past and will continue to do in the future is tell the story that people are trying to erase right now in 2025, all right? We're fighting battles that should have been won hundreds of years ago. And the mere fact that I have to stand before you this evening and tell you what's going on right now is an indication of how serious these times are. We don't have time to play. So brothers, can you roll that scroll up for me and then bring it over here when you're done? So I want to jump into my presentation. I've got a lot that I want to talk about, and I promise not to take a long time doing this. I want to so hopefully we get the connection here with the PowerPoint and get everything in sync. There we go, Kemet in the desert. Thank you, brother. Thank you, 6 brothers, for helping me illustrate why we are here and why history matters. And I'm going to zero in on the topic for tonight, why Kemet matters. Kemet in the desert, why Kemet matters. Why Kemet matters is the title of my forthcoming publication, which is the 3rd in the series of Browder File essays. That publication will be out this summer. The subtheme is the restoration of a stolen legacy. So I want to begin, I have to turn it on first, Browder. There we go. I want to begin just by acknowledging something about who I am and what credibility I have to discuss this subject matter. I've been traveling to Africa for 44 years. And in the process of traveling to Africa, I've been studying African history for 48 years. I didn't begin my study until after I graduated from college, 3 years after I graduated from college. So everything that I'm going to share with you all this evening, none of this I learned in elementary school, high school, or college. Zero, absolutely zero. But what I did learn in school was to cultivate an appreciation for learning. I learned to love to read. I learned to love history. And with that learning, I could then focus my time and energies on a history that mattered to me, and that was African history. I've made over 75 trips to the continent of Africa. 68 of those trips have been to Egypt. I've authored or co-authored 15 books, and I've been involved in the process of excavating and restoring tombs in Egypt for 15 years, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that process because it's something that I'm sure none of you all have heard about on the news or read about in newspapers. Even though we've made history, we have continuously been written out of history by some folk. So it's important to let you all know, I say this often and I mean it from the bottom of my heart. I'm no different than you. I'm a brother who grew up on the west side of Chicago. So my experiences are just like the experiences of most of you all. I was fortunate to have people in my life, specifically men in my life, who helped put me on the path that determined the rest of my life. I didn't meet my biological father until 2 years ago. Right, so I know what it's like for a black child to grow up not having a father figure. I know how that impacts you mentally, emotionally, and that these are facts of life that don't have to define your life. Right? If you are fortunate to have people in your life who care about ensuring that you are properly groomed and educated, if you're willing to listen to elders who are there in your life to help pour knowledge into you so that you can make something of yourself and make a contribution to your family and your community, then you are truly blessed. So there are three people I want to acknowledge who helped to shape the man that you see before you today. And I have no problem acknowledging the people who made me. The first person is Dr. Ivan Van Sertima. It was 48 years yesterday, on February the 21st, 1977, that I met Dr. Ivan Van Sertima. He was giving a lecture at Georgetown Law School in Washington, D.C. He had just published his book, They Came Before Columbus, The African Presence in America. And in that book, Dr. Van Sertima, who is from Guyana, continued the research of other scholars who had documented the pre-Columbian presence of African people in the continent of America. And Van Sertima showed the physical evidence. I was blessed to have traveled to Mexico twice with Van Sertima. I was blessed to be able to call him my friend, my colleague. And so it was Van Sertima who proved that Africans had traveled to America 2,500 years before Christopher Columbus was born. And then he said something that freed my mind. I used to say he blew my mind, but in fact, he freed my mind when he told me that these people who traveled to Egypt were people who had traveled to America, had traveled from Egypt, and they were African. And that was the first time in my life anyone ever told me that the ancient Egyptians were black. I've been out of college for 3 years and had never heard these words before. And it turned my world right side up. So I thank Van Sertima for putting me on the path. The second person I want to acknowledge is Dr. John Henry Clark. I met Dr. Clark the month after I returned from my first trip to Egypt with Dr. Ben. And as I sat in the audience and listened to Dr. Clark talk, I knew that this was a man that I wanted to learn from. So I was fortunate, I was blessed to be able to sit at his feet and have him pour his knowledge into me. The third person I want to acknowledge is Asa Hilliard. I met Asa Hilliard in the summer of 1982. And Asa, influenced me like no other person in my life. And so it was Dr. Clark who was he was the founding president of the African Heritage Studies Association. And that was an organization back in 1969 that helped to extend Negro History Week into Black History Month in 1977. Dr. Clark was also one of the founding members of ASCAC, the Association for the Study of Classical African Civilization. Asa Hilliard was one of the founding members of ASCAC. He also was one of the principal organizers of the Nile Valley Conference, which was held in September of 1984 on the campus of Morehouse College. And those 4 days that I spent in the audience at the Nile Valley Conference was when I realized what I wanted to do with my life. As I saw these scholars, male and female, black and white, talk about the primacy of Nile Valley culture and civilization, I said, that's what I want to do. And then Ivan Van Sertima was also one of the organizers of the Nile Valley Conference, and he also was the editor of the Journal of African Civilizations, one of the most important publications in African history. It was Asa Hilliard who wrote the introduction to my first book, From the Browder File, in 1989. It was Dr. Clark who wrote the introduction to my second book, Nile Valley Contributions to Civilization, in 1992. And it was Van Sertima who put a story about Nile Valley contributions in a copy of the Journal of African Civilization. So as I stated previously, I'm blessed to have known these men, to have traveled to Africa with these men, and to be able to call them friends, literally to be able to pick up the phone and call them whenever I had a question. And to have these brothers, these father figures, these men share with me information which changed my life for the better. So I am who I am because of them. And what I want you all to realize, what I want you all to understand, that the history of Africa is like an iceberg. And we've been told that only 10% of an iceberg is visible. 90% of it is below the surface. The same can be said about African history. We don't even know African history. And most of us don't even know that we don't know African history. And so if we look at what Cheikh Anta Diop said, one of the most important African scholars of the 20th century. Cheikh Anta Diop said that the history of Black Africa will remain suspended in air and cannot be written correctly until African historians dare to connect it with the history of Egypt. And I want to add to what Diop said, and say that the history of Egypt will remain suspended in air until it is connected with the history of Kemet, Kush, the Nile Valley, Africa, and Africans in the diaspora. So what I've been blessed to be able to do is something that Sheikh Jacques, Clark, Asa, or Van Sertima was not able to do. But I was able to do these things because of my relationship with them. And I'll share with you some of the profound discoveries that I've made and what they foretell for our future. So in order to understand African history, we must first understand 4 things. We must understand geography, terminology, chronology, and historiography. These 4 ways of seeing the world and seeing Africa are crucial if we're truly to understand this continent and the culture that sprang from this continent. So if we deal with geography, the Nile Valley is important because the Nile Valley is 4,160 miles long. The Nile Valley is the valley through which the Nile River flows. What's important to note is the Nile River is the longest river in the world. What's important to note is the Nile River is the only river in the world which flows from south to north, right? I want you to get that. I want you to understand that. So in order to really understand that, you have to understand geography. So water follows gravity. Water flows downhill. So if the Nile River flows from the south to the north, then if you look at that terrain, then you understand that the south is the higher elevation and the north is the lower elevation. And the people along the Nile Valley oriented themselves up south to the land of their ancestors. So to people within the entire Nile Valley, they saw the south is up and the north is down. And in the language of Kemet, Medu Neter, they oriented themselves to the south. So that our world as we know it has literally been turned upside down. Why? Because the maps that we've been using, the maps that we've seen in every classroom we've ever been in, were maps that were created by a Flemish cartographer in the 15th century. So when you make the maps, you orient yourself to where you are. Europeans made the map, so Europeans put Europe at the top of the world and everybody else at the bottom of the world. When you make the maps, when you have the power, you can do whatever you want to do, right? You can change the Gulf of Mexico to the Gulf of whatever you want to call it when you have the power, right? So things have not changed. All history is a current event. And all it does is repeat itself over and over and over again. So when you look at the terrain of the Nile Valley, you see that there's 2 branches of the Nile River. The White Nile comes out of Uganda at the foothills of the Mountain of the Moon. The Blue Nile comes out of Ethiopia, Lake Tana in Ethiopia. The 2 singular Nile rivers meet in Khartoum and form the single Nile River, which flows from Khartoum through the rest of Sudan, through the rest of Egypt, and entered into and created the Mediterranean Sea. So again, as Dr. Clark often told us, the Nile River was the world's oldest cultural highway. And people followed the flow of the Nile, bringing themselves and their cargo of knowledge down north with them. Down north with them. So once you have that context, it then sets things into greater context. So Nile Valley civilization began up south and migrated down north. The other thing that we have to be familiar with is terminology. Names are everything. And so the name of a person or a place or a thing means much more than we've ever been taught. So I'm going to just do a quick survey. What do you call this building? Pyramid. It's not a trick question. All right. All right. What do you call this statue here? All right. What do you call the country where these 2 objects can be found? Egypt, right, all right? So, right, but wrong. Wrong, all right? Why do I say that, right? Why do I say that? Because these are Greek words. And as I showed you on the timeline, these things were built before Greece even existed. So if you don't know the original name of a person or a place or a thing, you don't know squat. You might think you do, and the more you defend your indefensible position, you show those who have a little bit of wisdom how ignorant you really are. So it's important to reclaim the original names and the meanings associated with the names. I can do a whole lecture just on these 3 words, right? But I don't have the time. But what I want you to know, the pyramid is a Greek word which means little flat cake, like a pancake. This building does not look like a pancake. The original name for this building is Mir, M-I-R. And the word Mir means the place of ascension. It would be good for some of y'all to take notes because I'm going to be talking about a lot of stuff, right? And you might want to jot it down so that you can remember later on, right? Mir means the place of ascension. It's also important for you to realize, and I want you to get this. I really want you to get this, despite what you've heard on National Geographic or the Discovery Channel. Pyramids or mirrors are not tombs. They're not tombs. There's 118 mir in ancient Egypt, and no physical bodies have ever been buried in any of them. 0, none. So anytime anybody tells you that this structure is a tomb, either they're lying to you or they're ignorant. In either way, they're dangerous. The word mir means place of ascension. And mir were placed over tombs. So in contemporary language, we might refer to an object that's placed over a tomb as what? A tombstone, a grave marker. So that's all that structure is. The tombs were buried in the ground underneath. The bodies were buried underground. None were put inside of these buildings. None, 0. So the word mir means place of ascension. What's the concept behind this? The idea was that this structure was designed to facilitate the ascension of the soul buried in the tomb underneath it into heaven, where that soul would be reborn. All right? And there is a text that is erroneously referred to as the pyramid text that was found inside of a tomb that describes where souls go to be resurrected. There is a specific place in the heavens where souls go. Talked about the process of the judgment of the soul. And all of this was documented in Africa hundreds of years before Abraham was born. Before the creation of Judaism, Christianity, or Islam, African people had already identified the process for the salvation of the soul and where souls go to be reborn. So knowing your history allows you to understand what God is and how significant a proper relationship with the Creator can be for your life and your afterlife. The word sphinx is a Greek word which means to strangle or to hold. The African word is her-imaket, which means Heru on the horizon. Who is Heru? Heru was the son of God. So before Napoleon's soldiers shot the nose and lips off of this statue, one would have seen what was obvious. The image of the Son of God was the image of a black man. Egypt is a Greek word that was used to describe one temple in one part of the country. The original name for the country is Kemet. Kemet means the nation of the black people. The nation of the black people. Kemet does not mean the black soil, like National Geographic would tell you. And I keep referencing National Geographic because they've been responsible for miseducating millions of people every single year. They know better, but they choose not to do better. Kemet means the nation of the black people, just as the word Sudan means the nation of the black people, just as the word Ethiopia means the nation of the black people. So there's consistency in how these people in these ancient civilizations saw themselves and identified themselves, but we've been disconnected from this history for obvious reasons. So this timeline here illustrates the differences between Kemet and Egypt. Chronology is important because anytime anybody talks about a particular point in time in history, you have to ask yourself, where does it fall on the timeline? What's the chronology? And so what I've done is build on something that Sahilya talked about, and that is he divided Kemet into 4 golden ages. The first golden age was when all the mir were built in Kemet. The second golden age was when all of the great literature of Kemet was written. The third golden age was the 18th and 19th dynasty, when all of the temples and monuments, the most tourists who travel to Egypt today go to see monuments that were built during this time frame. The fourth golden age is the 25th dynasty, the period in the history of Nile Valley civilization that John Henry Clark refers to as Africa's last great walk in the sun. It was the last time in the history of the world that Africans were the most powerful leaders of the world. They controlled over 45% of the continent of Africa and the region of Northeast Africa that we refer to as the Middle East. So the work that we've been doing with the Asa Restoration Project, the excavation and restoration of tombs, has been the tombs of the 25th dynasty. So we found some things that I'm going to share with you this evening that will blow your mind. So I also want to share with you images of the people who lived during these four golden ages, so that you can be clear about who they were, but more importantly, you can be clear about who they are not. So here you see images of the kings who are responsible for uniting the two lands of Upper and Lower Kemet, establishing the first dynasty, and overseeing the construction of the first man-made structure of stone. Even though noses have been knocked off and some lips have been knocked off, you can still tell you're looking at the images of African people. These are all images that were created during their lifetime, not recreations, 20th century or 19th century recreations. This is an image of Mentuhotep, the king of the 11th dynasty, another African person whose nose and lips are missing. 18th dynasty king, Amenhotep III, one of the most important rulers in human history. 25th dynasty king, Taharqa, the longest ruling king of the 25th dynasty. He was from Kush, the country that we now call Sudan. He was part of a dynasty of African rulers who came into Kemet to restore the land of their ancestors. These were their words. So these were all people from Kush and Kemet who maintained the oldest documented civilization known to mankind, over 3,000 years of continuous government and stabilization. And then the Greeks came in. Alexander Macedonia came in and conquered Kemet in 332 BC, changed the name of Kemet to Egypt. So this is the beginning of Egypt. This is when Kemet became non-African. The Greeks controlled Egypt for approximately 300 years until they were conquered by the Romans. And Augustus Caesar took control of Egypt away from the Greeks, and it became a province of the Roman Empire. And then in 648, Arabs came in and conquered Egypt. And since possession is 9/10 of the law, they now claim that all of this is their ancestral homeland. What's important to note is when Anwar Sadat was the second president, actually the third president of the United Arab Republic of Egypt, Sadat's father was Arab, but his mother was Kushite. His mother was Nubian. Sadat said that he was the first true pharaoh since pharaonic times, because he knew his history. He knew that the Kushites or the Nubians were part of the dynastic legacy of Kemet. And that's one of the reasons why many Egyptians despise Sadat to this very day. Context is everything. So here's another illustration that shows you, we lost our connection, so come on. There we go. So here is another illustration that shows you pictorially the differences between Kemet and Egypt. Kemet is African, there's no question about that. Egypt, not so much so. Right? I have no problems acknowledging that reality. So we have to remember, civilization of Kemet started up south in Inner Africa. And all the invasions of Kemet came from the north. Came from Europe or the Arabic world. Historiography is also important. So it's important to understand historiography is about mythology. It's about symbolism. It's about understanding Nile Valley sacred science. And so there's a myth that is the foundational myth of Kemet. And this myth has served as the mythology of other religions, the foundation of other religions. And it centers around Asar, who is said to be the mythological figure who was responsible for the uniting the two lands and establishing Kemet as a nation state. Asar was killed by his brother Set. So this story precedes the story of Cain and Abel. And in many respects, if you understand this story, you'll realize the people who wrote the story about Cain and Abel copied that story from the original story. And I mean that literally. They copied that story because this story is older than that story. So the story about Asar and Set is tied to another historical, mythological personality named Heru. And what's important to understand is that myths are not true, but they contain truth. Myths are not about personalities, but concepts and ideas that transcend personalities, that provide us with lessons, lifelong lessons that everyone can benefit from. And what's the lesson from this Trinity? This lesson is about life, death, and resurrection, rebirth. If you really drill down into the mythology, you'll find that the base of this lesson is about life, death, and rebirth. It's also about sacred science rooted in astronomy. This recreation here is a recreation of a site that was discovered in the 1970s, found near the Egyptian and Sudanese border, a site known as Nabta Playa. Nabta Playa is significant because it's the oldest astroarchaeological calendar in the history of the world, created around 7500 BC. 3,500 years before Stonehenge. The significance of this calendar is that it is oriented to the heliacal rising of the star that we know as Sirius and the constellation that we know as Orion. These two star systems were associated with Asar and his wife Set, and they also were associated with a natural event that happens every year in Kemet in the Nile Valley, and that is the annual flooding of the Nile. So what I'm saying here is that the people who created this culture and civilization studied their environment, studied the heavens, studied the relationship between what was happening in the stars and what was happening correspondingly here on Earth. And they saw a relationship that has been identified as above, so below. Things on Earth parallel things that are happening in the sky. So when you document what happens in the heavens, and you see that everything that happens in the heavens happens along a cyclical passage. And once you identify the cycles and the time frame for the appearance and disappearance of these celestial objects, then that allows you to create a calendar. They were responsible for creating the first calendar known to mankind. The first calendar of 365 and a quarter days was used in the Nile Valley as late as 4,230 BC. And this has all been documented beyond a shadow of a doubt. What's also is important is that once they codified this scientific information, they built structures in their country where this information could be taught. We call them temples, but in point of fact, they were actually universities where priests and priestesses studied the knowledge of the universe, documented it, and passed it down to future generations. That's all a part of this history and culture. So anyone who travels to Kemet will visit these historical sites. But what often happens if you don't go to Kemet with the right guide is that you'll only get the tip of the iceberg. You won't get the good stuff that's below the surface. So for anyone who goes to Kemet, go on a study tour. If you go to Egypt and you're not a part of a study tour, it's like going to your favorite museum with the blindfold on in darkness. You won't see any of the greatness that is there to be seen if you don't go with the right folk. So again, context. People talk about Cleopatra. Well, to be honest with you, Cleopatra ain't squat. If you understand the history of Kemet, Cleopatra ain't squat, right? So I found this meme online this year, and it kind of puts things into a correct historical perspective. Cleopatra ruled Egypt closer in time to the invention of the iPhone then to the construction of the Great Pyramids at Giza, huh? And that's real. Here's the timeline. Cleopatra died in 30 BC, right here. 30 BC is closer to when the iPhone was created around 2002, 2005, right? The pyramids of Giza were built around 2400 BC. So she is further away from the construction of the pyramids, closer to the construction, the creation of the iPhone than the construction of the pyramid. Context is everything. Chronology is everything. So once you have the correct chronological perspective, you can begin the process of reclaiming your history and reclaiming your mind. So to summarize what I've shared with you all thus far, 3 points I want to make. 3 points that you can build on. One is 12,000 years ago, Africans in the Nile Valley studied nature and developed civil and religious systems and educational systems, and they created the most advanced civilization the world has ever known. 12,000 years ago, Africans created the most advanced civilization the world has ever known. Nile Valley civilization thrived for more than 7,000 years. I'm not just talking about Kemet, I'm talking about Kush, I'm talking about Ethiopia. That's all part of Nile Valley civilization. It thrived for more than 7,000 years and is the longest continuously existing civilization in human history. That's a fact. And that's a fact that should not be limited to February, Black History Month. Kemet represents the pinnacle of human accomplishments and was the gem of the Nile Valley and the light of the world. That's why some folk in the 20th century, early 20th century, had to take Egypt out of Africa and put it somewhere in the Middle East. All right? There's reasons behind everything. If you don't attempt to understand the reason why and how our world was shaped the way that it is, then you have no idea what's going on. Under African leadership, Kemet was a nation of many firsts. We can now say categorically beyond a shadow of a doubt. I only talk about what I know. I'm not saying these things to make you all feel good. I'm sharing with you historical facts, which you all should have been taught in elementary school. Imagine if I was your teacher in kindergarten. Imagine where you would be right now. Please. Everybody in here would have at least 2 or 3 PhDs. Let's get real. All right? The people in the Nile Valley were the first human beings to divide the day into 24 hours. Time is a man-made construct. Somebody invented time and created the units of measure which we use to identify the day of 24 hours, a calendar year of 365 and a quarter days. Somebody had to create that, and those somebodies lived in the Nile Valley. The alphabet, Medu Neter, so-called hieroglyphics, great literary works were invented in the Nile Valley. Yes, Africans were an oral people, but we were also the world's first literate people. Don't deny us that reality. Agriculture, geometry, taxes, and hydraulic systems were all developed in the Nile Valley, and they are a part of Nile Valley culture and civilization. Theological and spiritual systems that the world uses today, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, had their beginning in the Nile Valley thousands of years before they existed. That's a fact. The first government ruled by kings and administered by civil servants who oversaw massive civil work projects that were designed and built within the Nile Valley. The design of cities, temples, tombs, monuments, and mirror, that's all a part of Nile Valley culture and civilization. Kemet was responsible for giving the world its first middle class, its first civil servants, architects, engineers, philosophers, designers, mathematicians, astronomers, healers, scientists, social scientists, merchants, and warriors were part of this ancient culture. So what we know for a fact 6,260 years after the founding of Kemet, we can now state, based on facts, that the past was erased and that the erasure has been forgotten. We can now say, based on the study of documented facts, that ancient facts were falsified and presented as historical truths in order to separate Kemet from Egypt, Egypt from Africa, and African people from their own cultural legacy. We're the only people who have to prove that Kemet is in Africa, huh? Nobody questions what Greece is or Rome, but we got to prove that Egypt is in Africa. How mad is that? Again, Egypt is the only country that has to prove its geography. Craziness. So what is it we're talking about? We're talking about erasure. The erasure of people, history, culture, and traditions. It's been happening for hundreds of years, but right now in 2025, the erasure is on steroids. And you better wake up. You better realize what time it is, because what's happening right now is the tip of the proverbial iceberg. You have no idea what's coming next year and the year after that and the year after that. It's going to be a relentless assault against your humanity. About everything that you thought was secure, the rug is going to be pulled out from under everybody. I'm here to give you a heads up, to let you know. They say, what is it to be forewarned? It's to be forearmed. So I'm giving you all a heads up based on my study of history. There's nothing new in the world except the history you do not know. So you study history to understand where you are in the cycle. So we are experiencing in this country, in Europe, in Egypt, Afrophobia, anti-African sentiment, which is the perceived fear and hatred of the cultures and people of Africa, as well as Africans in the diaspora. We got a little reprieve in the spring of 2000 when the world witnessed the murder of George Floyd. And because it was filmed, people began to take us seriously when we talked about black men being murdered by police officers. They saw it on film. This courageous 18-year-old girl documented that murder, which the world saw. And for a moment, it touched the hearts of people all over the world. And so concessions were made. Corporations said that they were going to do better. Politicians said that we're going to enact laws to make things better. And they did for a little bit, but now they're going back to their old ways. And it's going to get worse. All right? Afrophobia shows up as opposition to African studies. It shows up as opposition to critical race theory. It shows up as a revision of slave history. Well, slavery gave Africans job skills. All right? I mean, that's what they're actually pushing in Florida, in Virginia, in Texas. So my question to you is, what are you doing to stop it? What are you doing to challenge it? It doesn't do any good to complain to your friends in the barbershop if you're not doing something to challenge that in your homes and your communities right now and for the rest of your lives. That's what time it is. Afrophobia shows up as the effort to erase DEI. And y'all have seen it just within the past 2 weeks. Just within the past 2 weeks. The military is no longer acknowledging the Tuskegee Airmen. Get to that. Right now in 2025. You never thought you'd see this happen, did you? It's because you don't know history. This day was always coming. It was simply a matter of time. And so they want you to be asleep. They want you to dream, right? Because dreams only happen when you're asleep. But when you're awake, or woke as they call it, you have the presence of mind to see what they're doing. And if you have historical consciousness, then you will begin to do something about it. You will push back. You will say, hell no, I'm not going back into slavery. That's right. Making America great again is about taking us back to 1860. before our liberation. That's what the Nazis in the White House want to do. And be clear about it. Be clear about what is happening right now. And it's not going to stop. You can't pray your way out of this, brothers and sisters, because Jesus ain't going to help you with this one. All right? You're going to have to rely on a different power, a power that you've always had, but your oppressor never told you that you had it. They never told you where to find it or how to use it, but you got it. So that a book I wrote 29 years ago, Survival Strategies for Africans in America, is a playbook for 2025. I saw this coming. And I wrote about what you can do in order to not just survive, but to thrive. 13 steps to freedom. And freedom is literally freeing your mind, because the process begins first in your mind. If your mind ain't free, if you have legislative freedom, if your freedom is legislated into existence, it can also be legislated what? Out of existence, which is what they're doing right now. They pulled away funding for HBCUs, They're eroding gains that were made in 64, 65, and putting us behind the 8 ball. So things will get worse for the rest of your life. Know that. And the question is, you going to be a chump and just sit back and take it, or you going to do something about it? Now's the time to stand up. And you don't just stand up and shout and yell. And no, those days are over. You have to be strategic. You have to be strategic. As Dr. Clark used to say, marching is a serious waste of shoe leather. We're past the point of marching. You march with your pocketbook. You march with your wallet, because the only thing these devils understand is money. And when you withhold your money, you will get their attention. And I'm not talking about withholding your money on February the 28th. You withhold your money for Memorial Day, for the 4th of July, for Juneteenth, for Thanksgiving, for Christmas. You hold your money because you're going to need it. Eggs now are over, what, $10 a gallon? Huh? Oh, okay, $10 a dozen. The gas is going to go up too. You know, my mind is so confused. This world is going crazy. But it, again, it's just the tip of the iceberg. I'm not trying to frighten anybody. I just want to make you aware of what is coming. All right? This picture was taken 2 weeks ago in the FBI building, right outside of D.C. They are erasing DEI. They're eradicating wokeness. Why? Because, you know, if they level the playing field, we will exceed them. The only way these devils can succeed is by keeping us behind the 8 ball, by manipulating laws and disadvantaging us. That's the only way they can succeed. And it's happening now like never before. So in survival strategies, I list 13 steps that we need to be aware of. And I don't just talk about what the issues are. I give you a prescription on how to incorporate this information into your life. So this book, this 29-year-old book, is a playbook for 2025. And one of the first strategy is understanding that racism and white supremacy are the most persistent problems that you will ever face throughout your entire life. Persistent problems. They will never go away as long as someone else controls your destiny. So you're going to have to figure out how to negotiate within this environment so that you're not adversely affected. I can't tell you how many friends of mine in D.C. where I live have lost their jobs and are afraid of how they're going to pay their mortgage or put their children in school. These folk don't care. They don't care. And if you don't care, then game over. You've got to care like never before. So I want to share with you part of their playbook. This ain't nothing new, folk, because they've been talking about this for a long time. This is nothing new. There's a book called Agnotology, The Making and Unmaking of Ignorance. Agnotology is the study of culturally induced ignorance or doubt. Culturally induced ignorance or doubt, particularly with the publication of inaccurate or misleading scientific data and the creation of institutions to promote disinformation, like Fox Television and certain publications. They exist specifically to spew lies, to confuse the general public. Black, white, they don't care. They're aiming for everybody. Everybody. And this expresses itself throughout educational institutions, media, religious institutions, political organizations, and social institutions. Every aspect of life as we know it is infected with this illness. So how do we engage in the unmaking of ignorance? It's an important question. And you can't be afraid to ask questions. You can't be afraid to deal with problems. A good friend of mine, Dr. Patricia Newton, psychiatrist in Baltimore, cousin of Huey P. She told me a long time ago, Tony, never be afraid of problems. Problems are wonderful things. Why? Because every problem has a solution, right? So what you have to begin to do is study the problem. What is the source of the problem? How does it show up in your life? How does it impact your life? And once you study those things, you can begin to recognize the problem before it surfaces and avoid it, right? Or once it comes into your life, you know how to neutralize it so it doesn't neutralize you, so it doesn't kill you, so it doesn't make you sick, so it doesn't hospitalize you, so it doesn't cause you to act out in such a way that you will jeopardize your future, the future of your spouse, and the future of your family. Every action has repercussions. So we need to take control of the things that go on in our lives, which means that we've got to be prepared and confront problems, find the solutions within the problems, and utilize them continuously. So how do we engage in the unmaking of ignorance? Every one of you all should read and study Carter G. Woodson's landmark book, The Miseducation of the Negro. This ain't nothing new, folk. Carter G. Woodson was the second African American to receive a PhD from Harvard. And when he wrote an article for Marcus Garvey in Garvey's World, Woodson acknowledged that it took him 30 years to get Harvard out of his brain. Woodson realized that he was miseducated, and he realized that he needed to do something to re-educate himself. That's why he invented Negro History Week in 1926. So Woodson understood very clearly, he understood that you don't just set aside 1 week to study your history. No! Woodson said you study your history 365 for the rest of your life. You teach it to your children every single day. But he said you set aside 1 week in February where your children can demonstrate to the community what they have learned. That's what we saw tonight with the young folk here singing and dancing and demonstrating to the community what they learned. This should be happening all the time in every community throughout the United States of America, because it's crucial to our ability, to our capacity to not only survive, but to thrive. I'm tired of surviving. It's time to thrive. And we have everything we need to thrive. We've always had everything we needed to survive. Ain't no leader gonna save you. Ain't no one single person gonna save you. Neither will their God save you. It hasn't happened in 400 years. It ain't gonna happen. Your leader looks at you in the mirror when you comb your hair or brush your teeth. So it's about cultivating knowledge within you and knowing how to apply that knowledge. That's what prepares you to step out into the world and face whatever obstacle comes your way. That's what time it is. You need to read Amos Wilson's The Falsification of African Consciousness. Read that book, study that book, understand what he's talking about. You need to read Nile Valley Contributions to Civilization. I put myself in there, yes. Yes. You need to have books in your house. You need to have a library. What you read determines your consciousness. If you spend more time watching television, playing video games, than reading, studying, and applying what you've read and studied in your life, if you spend more time with entertainment, your life is already over. You just don't know it. So, step number 2 in survival strategies is understanding the media and how the media shapes consciousness. The media is the most powerful form of mental manipulation ever created. And it's doing an outstanding job in destroying the minds of our young folk. We've had at least 2 generations whose minds have been destroyed by mindless consumption of media content on YouTube, on TikTok, on Facebook. So much so that Dr. Jules Harrell, a psychologist at Howard University, said in the 1990s that so many young folk have spent so much time on social media, so much time playing video games, so much time watching music videos, right? That this unchecked consumption of media has literally rewired the neurons in their brain, making them incapable of paying attention for more than 10 or 15 minutes, making it difficult for them to read and to reason. We've had over 2 generations of our children succumb to this insanity. Ask anybody, ask any teacher, what's it like being in a classroom today? And they would tell you it's madness. And who do I blame? I blame the parents. Because they're your children. You brought them in the world, and you have a responsibility to see to it that they are properly educated before they leave the house. The first school is in the womb. So we've got to step up and assume responsibility if we want to see a change in our lives. But talking about the media has been my thing. I've spent most of my career involved in one way or another with the media. And it's important to note that there are numerous theaters throughout the United States that are called the Egyptian theater, right? You all, they just recently held, every February, they have the Sundance Film Festival in Colorado. You ever notice the name of the theater where they have the Sundance Film Festival? It's called the Egyptian Theater. The first theater where they had the Hollywood premiere was called the Egyptian Theater, right? This is the Egyptian Theater in Hollywood, and the interior of this theater, built in 1922, is built like an Egyptian temple. Why? Because the Egyptian temple was a place where minds were reformed, where minds were shaped. So the idea is you use this theater, you use this environment to rewire the thinking and the consciousness of everybody who sits in these seats. So in that context, y'all familiar with the Mummy films? There's been dozens and dozens of films produced by Hollywood about the Mummy. Dozens and dozens of films. They keep making films about the Mummy, but stop and think about that story. Boris Karloff was the first Mummy film. Anybody remember the name of Boris Karloff's mummy? Imhotep. Right. Imhotep. And who is Imhotep? Imhotep was the architect, the engineer, the world's first multi-genius, the man who built the Step Pyramid at Saqqara, a 19-story skyscraper. The world's first multi-genius is a man named Imhotep, and Hollywood has personified him as an evil figure. That's intentional. There's a marvelous book that you all need to have in your library called Imhotep, the African Architect of the Cosmos, written by 2 white men, Robert Bravall and Thomas Brophy. There have been over 18 films about Cleopatra, from silent films to contemporary films, all about Cleopatra. Everybody talks about Cleopatra. Everybody talks about Cleopatra. Cleopatra wasn't squat. So all of these films about Cleopatra featured white women, but a couple of years ago, 2 years ago, Jada Pinkett Smith was the executive producer of a film about Cleopatra that featured a mixed race woman. And Egyptians had a hissy fit. They accused black folk of appropriating their history and culture, right? When you don't know yourself, when you don't know how to defend your history, others will take it and accuse you of doing things that they've been doing for generations. So forget Cleopatra. Forget Cleopatra. Instead, focus your attention on an unabashed, bad African sister. This is Queen T, wife of Amenhotep III. A bad sister. Every time I see this image, it reminds me of Frances Cress Welsing, rocking that afro and that serious, no-nonsense face. You don't mess with me. You don't mess with my family. You don't mess with my homeland. She was serious. And if you've ever been to the Cairo Museum, the biggest statue in the Cairo Museum is a statue of Queen T and her husband, Amenhotep III. They were like the Barack and Michelle Obama of Nile Valley times. They were a real power couple, and she was equal in power to her husband. That's why with this statue, it's one of the only statues you'll find in Kemet where the wife is the same size as her husband. This is who we should be making films about. This is the person whose life we should be elevating. And if you just focus on this one family, 18th dynasty, focus on this one family, you'll find much to be proud of. Their son, Amenhotep IV, changed his name to Akhenaten. And he had a son named Tutankhamun. And after his father died or was murdered, his handlers changed his name to Tutankhamun. But he was an African. He was of African heritage. So when National Geographic gives you this image, then you need to say that's a lie. And I have the evidence to prove that that's a lie. If you can't defend your culture, somebody else will run away with it. Here's an image in the Louvre of Asar, the founding father of Kemet. Asar is documented in history, is documented in mythology, and I want y'all to get this. I really want y'all to understand this. He's documented in history as the first person who died and was resurrected. And was resurrected. And we're talking about his story predates the story of this other man by at least 4,000 years. And if you follow the story, don't have to, I can do a 2-hour lecture just on his story and his wife. His wife, Aset, was a virgin. And after her husband was murdered, she reassembled his body, put him together, and before she buried him, the spirit of Asar impregnated his virgin wife. And then 9 months later, the virgin Aset gave birth to this son, Heru, the son of God. And his job was to restore his father's kingdom. Does that story sound familiar? Huh? Y'all need to know the truth. And the truth will set you free. So there was a movie that came out called The Gods of Egypt, in which all white actors played historically African figures, right? Chad Boseman was offered a part in this film. And because he went to Howard University and worked at a black bookstore 2 blocks north of Howard University, and as a result of working in that bookstore, he sold Dr. Welsing's book. He sold Dr. Clark's book. He sold Amos Wilson's book. He sold my books. So he knew his history. So he said he will take a role in that film as Jehuti, the personality who represents divine speech and thought. And he will play that role because he wanted an African to play an accurate historical figure, right? So you had a white guy play Heru, another white guy play Set. So it's important to understand how films have been used to appropriate culture and history, to hijack culture and history. But all of these attempts to hijack culture and history have not been negative. Y'all know this brother here? Ryan Coogler. He's from Oakland. Ryan Coogler grew up in a family of conscious parents who were Black Panthers, who studied history, and they made sure his son knew his history. Ryan Coogler had only done 2 films when Marvel approached him and asked him to direct Black Panther. He'd only done 2 films. He went to make Black Panther, and that movie made $1.3 billion. Huh? With his 3rd film, this young brother became the most successful Black filmmaker in the history of films. So what did he do with Disney's $150 million? He remade the story of Asar and Set. So if you know your history, right? If you know your history, you can see it in films. Chad Boseman and his cousins, right? Chad played the role of Heru, and his cousin Killmonger played the role of Set. So if you see that film from that historical perspective, if you understand Nile Valley culture and civilization, you'll get a different impression from the film Black Panther. And Ryan Coogler was brilliant in how he incorporated African history and culture in that film. Most folk missed it, but it's there if you know what to look for, right? How did Black Panther begin? It began with the myth of the Black Panther, right? And we got a group of Black Panthers here in the audience, right? We got a group of Black Panthers in the audience. So what was the name of that person who showed the first king who directed him to the heart-shaped herb? I'm asking them. Bast. Bast. Who is Bast? Bast is a Kemetic personality who comes from the Nile Valley. So the beginning of Black Panther begins in Kemet, in the Nile Valley. So in the comic book, you see an image where the Black Panther goes to Kemet. He goes to the temple of Bast, right? So we got our history and culture right in front of our eyes. So Ryan Coogler very strategically found a way to present liberating information in the film and hid it in plain sight. But if you don't know your history and culture, it went right over your head. It was a great movie, but it was greater than a great movie. Greater than a great movie. So much so that there was another lesson that was there to be learned. That movie was nominated for, I think, 7 or 8 Oscars. And what is the Oscar? The Oscar is the highest award given by the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences. The Oscar was a statue that was created in 1929, right? The highest award given by the Association of Artists and Craftsmen for the film industry. So the person who created the Oscar studied African history, and he modeled the Oscar after that image. That's the image of Ptah, the patron saint of artists and craftsmen in Kemet. Huh? So our history is right in front of our faces. But if you don't know it, if you think, oh, that's just that black stuff, you're going to miss out on an opportunity to free your mind. And if you miss out on that opportunity, it's your fault. It was Ptah that was the inspiration behind the creation of the step mirror of Zoser. Ptah was the inspiration for Imhotep, the world's first multi-genius. So Black Panther did win, 3 Oscars, right? So it's important to understand the whole meaning behind this pose. I don't have this image in my slide, but this pose, the Wakanda Forever pose, is the pose that comes straight out of Kemet. All of the mummies, the so-called mummies, were buried in this pose. That pose has meaning, cultural significance, spiritual significance. So Ryan Coogler was giving us something to build on at a time when we would need it the most. So let me begin to wind down by focusing on the work that I've been doing for the past 16 years that has consumed my life, but I now understand that it was the reason why I became interested in Nile Valley culture and civilization 48 years ago. Everything that I've been doing for the past 48 years was preparing me for this moment in time. I can look back on my life and see now why I've done everything that I've done. So the Asa Restoration Project was dedicated in honor of my colleague Asa Hilliard, who, like Runoko Rashidi, died in Egypt. Asa passed on August the 13th, 2007. And so as I was grieving the loss of my friend, the loss of my brother, I was gifted with an opportunity to become involved in an archaeological excavation. A friend of mine, a good Egyptian friend of mine, had turned me on to someone who had just recently discovered these tombs and made arrangements for me to do a private visit of these tombs. And then when I visited that tomb, I saw the significance of what was there and made a commitment to raise funds to ensure that this work would continue, because nobody else wanted to fund this work. Why? Because it was 25th dynasty. The 25th dynasty, let me give it to you this way. There are 30 dynasties in dynastic Kemet, 30 families of rulers. And the 25th dynasty is the only one of the 30 dynasties that contemporary Egyptologists will say was black. They refer to the 25th dynasty as the Negro dynasty, which implies that the other 29 were not black. That's a lie. But we know we got the 25th dynasty. All right, so can you give me some water? Okay, so I'll be finished in 10 minutes, no problem. So, moving right along. To have an opportunity to fund an excavation of 25th dynasty tombs and to actually participate was something that was totally unexpected, but I had been prepared to do that all my life. So let me just share with you a little bit of what we've been doing. And again, I'm certain that you all never saw anything in the news about this, never read anything in the newspaper about the history that we've been making for the past 15 years. We're the first black people in history to fund and coordinate in an archaeological excavation in Egypt. So it's a tomb, it's 3 tombs. Thank you, thank you. It's 3 tombs of Kushite priests. The primary tomb is the tomb of this priest by the name of Karakamen. So Karakaman's tomb, and here's an aerial shot that was taken in 2013. A friend of mine who was with our group just happened to be in a balloon, and that balloon just happened to float over our site. So this is the only aerial shot that we have at that site. Thank you, brother.
Yes, sir.
And so you see here the entrance to all 3 tombs. And the primary tomb is here, the tomb of Karakamen. The ceiling of that tomb collapsed in the 1990s. So you can now look inside of the tomb and see here what you can't see here or here. You see the steps leading down into the tombs. And to give you a sense of context, this is a person. This is a group of people. Tombs are huge. They're carved some 23 feet under the ground, carved out of the living limestone bedrock. So the creation of these tombs is not architecture, it's sculpture. They carved out walls, floors, ceilings, pillars, and then covered every square inch of the walls and the ceilings and the pillars with metanetra, hieroglyphics, and carvings, beautiful carvings. And they painted every single thing. It's a magnificent tomb. So here's a photograph that was taken in 2010. And Karakamen's tomb was divided into 2 sections. This is the first pillared hall. This is the beginning of the excavations in the second pillared hall. There were 8 pillars in the first pillared hall, 8 pillars that were 10 feet tall that collapsed when the tomb was damaged or destroyed in the flood. So everything collapsed into the sand. And so as we excavated, so here's like a little bit below ground level. This is all flood debris. So all of this had to be excavated. Had tiny little buckets. And men every day would take a handful of debris out of the bucket, march it up, and dump it in the truck all day long, 6 days a week, 6 hours a day, in 115-degree temperature. You think it's hot here in Las Vegas? Yeah, you spend some time in Egypt during the summer. We work 4 months out of the year in the summer, right? Nobody in their right mind works in the summer in Egypt, but because nobody works in Egypt, we were able to go there and work and hire people who weren't working so we can hire them at a lower rate, right? But you do what you got to do to get the work done, right? So here we're removing the debris, and as we're removing the debris, we found fragments. So we removed 2,700 tons of debris. And in the process of excavating, we found over 34,000 fragments. Pieces as small as my thumb to pieces as large as an automobile. Every single fragment had to be cleaned. It had to be measured, had to be registered, had to be photographed, and then put into storage so that we could then, at some point, once the excavation was done, begin to use the fragments to rebuild the tomb. That's what the restoration and the Asa Restoration Project is all about. So then, this is one example of us rebuilding one of the pillars in the first pillared hall. We had a stump that was about 3 feet tall, and after the end of about 3 months, we restored it. Rebuilt it to its original height of 10 feet. Cost about $10,000 to do that work over the course of about 4 months. And there were 8 pillars in that particular part of the tomb. So moving along, this is the site. This is the beginning of the first pillared hall. This is the end of the second pillared hall. So this is Karakamen's tomb. This is the portion of his tomb that was underground. So we wound up restoring everything. This is the restoration of the first pillared hall. This is what it looked like originally. This is what it looks like now. This is the second pillared hall. What it looks like now, this is what it looked like in 2010. That's history. Everybody needs to know about this. Why aren't they documenting the good that we do? We hear about crime, we hear about violence, but we don't hear about the good things that are happening. So here's the important thing. These tombs, these 3 tombs were the tombs of Cushite priests. Cushite priests of Amen. Amen. Amen is an African word which identifies the unseen presence of God Almighty. And they worked at this site called Karnak Temple, I sit, on the west bank of the city of Luxor, or Karnak. This is the largest temple complex in the world. You can take every church built in London, put them inside of this temple, and you still have room for 2 football fields. And there were 4 men whose tombs we worked on. Actually, 3 men whose tombs we worked on, who worked at this site. Karakamen, this is Karakamen's baby brother, whose name is Harold Maquette. He was the chief priest at Karnak Temple. He oversaw all the activities that went on within this space, which housed 83,000 men and women. Amen is an African word which means the unseen presence of God. So every time you end your prayers with the word amen, you're calling on the name of an African concept of the Creator, whether you know it or not. This is, gosh, I'm blanking on the name. This has been a long day. So these are the priests whose tombs we excavated and restored. Karakamen, Karabashkin, and this is Nezbanejed, right? So what we found when we completed the excavation and started excavating on the surface level, we found the footprints of pylons. So pylons indicate the presence, that this structure is not only a tomb, it's a temple. Only temples have pylons. So we found the footprints for 3 pylons, which means that this was a temple tomb. It was not a place where someone was just buried and then he walked away. It was a place where members of his group came regularly to engage in rituals within that sacred space. So these tombs or temple tombs in South Ossetif were not unlike the temple tombs that were built in Kush, hundreds of miles up south. So we found more than 40 tombs at this site, which is the largest Kushite presence in Kemet. And every new tomb we discover allows us to access a new ancestors whose name, whose memory was lost to time and space. So every time we found a new tomb and identified a new ancestor, we poured libation to do what we're supposed to do, speak the name of the dead so that they can live again. And there's a statement that was written during the 19th dynasty by a priest by the name of Ani that encourages human beings, conscious human beings, to pour libation to your father and mother who rest in the valley of the ancestors. The nature of the various aspects of God will witness your actions and they will accept it. We are encouraged to not to forget to do this even when we're away from home. For as we pour libation to our ancestors, our children will ultimately pour libation to us when we become ancestors. That's the circle of life, baby. That's what this whole thing is all about, right? So out of all these marvelous things that we did, the most important event occurred on September the 28th, 2016. That's when I was fortunate enough, that's when I was blessed enough to make a discovery that changed everything. I went to visit some tombs in North Ossetif, an area about 2 miles north of where we were working, near the temple of Hatshepsut. And I was visiting a tomb, part of a group that was visiting a tomb. And as I walked into this space, as when I walk into any space, I'm always looking around. I'm always studying everything in the environment. And I saw something that caught my eye and blew my mind. I saw painted on the ceiling of a tomb this image. And it's not really clear because I couldn't get a clear shot because I wasn't supposed to be taking pictures, but I kind of did it on the DL. But what it is, sisters and brothers, is that a Adinkra symbol, the Adinkra symbol for Sankofa. It's called the Akoma Sankofa symbol. I found this symbol painted in 2 tombs that were right next to each other. So that prompted me to begin some research now that has moved me in an entirely different direction. I can now trace the migration of Sankofa symbols from the Nile to the Niger to your neighborhood. Because you got jewelry right outside this door with these same Adinkra symbols that can be traced back to the Nile Valley. In my book, my latest book, Finding Karakomen, I document all of this. And I could trace that in Waset, in these tombs from the 7th century BCE, we have that symbol. I was able to trace the origins of that symbol back to Kush as late as 1600 BC. And on Friday, September the 13th, 2024, a brother came to me with an image in a book that I already had, but it overlooked. He came to me with this image, which is from a piece of pottery that was created in Kush, 250 BC. Y'all recognize what that is? That's the Sankofa bird. Take that. I can now prove the migration of that knowledge, of that culture, of that symbolism from the Nile to the Niger. It surfaced in Ghana and Ivory Coast in the 18th century. And now it's used by Africans in America. So I want you all to understand the significance of this. I really want you all to get this. I really want you all to understand what all of this means because it does have meaning. I can now document beyond a shadow of a doubt the migration of African people and African culture from the Nile to the Niger. And since we know that Africans in the Niger were stolen and brought further west when they were enslaved, I can now make historical, cultural, and genetic connections between African Americans, Africans on the West Coast, and Africans on the East Coast. I got the receipts. I got the documentation. So I can force people to stop lying. They may not tell the truth, but at least I can force them to stop lying by presenting the truth that I know. Anybody who's ever been to New York, you should go up to the African burial ground, downtown Manhattan, where over 1,000 Africans were buried. And the logo of the African burial ground is the Sankofa symbol. Huh? So, and I'm winding down, Oscar, I'm winding down, right? So, as I wind down, we got to remember what Blyden told us. Your place in the universe is assigned as African. And there's no place for anything else. So as Asa Hilliard said, either to be African or not to be. You can't be somebody else. You can only be who you are. So know yourself, love yourself, and be the best example of the expression of the Creator that this life has to offer. And so the reality is you can't teach 300,000 years of African history in 1 month. So every day is a day that must be spent learning our history and culture. So that's what I've done with IKG. That's what I've done with our publications. There's a QR code that will take you to our website where you can see what we've done. You can get access to the materials that we have. And I want to share with you in closing what we're doing right now to help our young folk. We have a program called the Cultural Imperative Initiative. And of that program, we have a project that my daughter helped to take to the next level called the Cultural Imperative Program. It was a program that was designed specifically for young students. I was working with high school students in San Jose, California for 8 years where we developed this program. And once we had the program in place, my daughter created a curriculum and we took it national. We were in 12 cities before COVID shut us down, and we're now in the process of reactivating this program throughout the United States. Cultural Imperative Program. This is a group of students who came from San Jose, California to Washington, D.C. as part of their graduation ceremony. So we're in the process of preparing for our 2025 season. You can take a photograph of this, a screenshot of this, and go on our website and download information on how you can bring this activity to your home, to your community, to your school, to your church. If they want to ban the teaching of black history in our schools, then goddamn it, y'all teach it in your homes, all right? Your churches. We don't need anybody to validate us. Take ownership of that which is yours. So this is a poem that all of our students had to recite at the beginning and end of each session. We talked about Arthur Schomburg. You all should go online and Google an article by Arthur Schomburg called The Negro Digs Up His Past. It's 100 years old, and he told us in 1925 what we should be doing right now. We should be digging up our past. Because of what happened to us, we should be the most sophisticated antiquarian of them all. We should be studying history more so than anybody else on this planet because our history has been erased. So folk have been telling us for years. So wrapping up real quick, because I know we got to go. We got a new project that's going to be unfolded a month from today on March the 22nd in Washington, D.C. It's called the John Henry Clark Enhanced History Project, where keep your eyes open, go to our website. We'll be giving you details about this project. It's coming soon. And it was designed for these times. It was literally designed for these times. We're talking about books that you should be reading and studying, processes for how you should be studying this information. The John Henry Clark Enhanced History Project is coming your way soon. I'm not doing a tour to Kemet. I'm giving Kemet a break for a while. We're doing a study tour this summer to London and Paris. Why am I going to London and Paris? Because I'm going to the British Museum and the Louvre, the greatest crime scenes in the history of the world. If you want to study African history, you go to European museums because you will find our history in those museums. So we got some special activities planned. And again, you can go to our website, check out the QR code, and get a taste for what we're doing. We extend an invitation to anybody who's serious about wanting to know themselves and know how to act on that knowledge. I'm at this point in my life, I don't have time to play. I'm only dealing with people who are serious as I am. So if you want to be a part of something bigger than yourself, I invite you to join me. And I want to close by sharing the 16th anniversary celebration of the Asa Restoration Project in Washington, D.C. So I'll let this video clip speak for itself.
Ancient was a tree, ancient was the smile on the night, on the night remember the Nile? Do you remember the Nile? The pyramids that they built. The wisdom that reigned supreme. The peace that was in our hearts. Meditating your mind and soul. Take a journey. Take a journey with us on the Nile. Ancient was a
We represent the first time in the history of Egypt that African Americans have been involved in funding and participating in archaeological excavations.
on the Nile. Ancient was a dream. Ancient was a smile on the Nile. On the Nile. Karak, y'all.
In the beginning, our ancestors knew not. They studied. For 4,000 years, they learned all there was to know. They taught others. For 1,000 years, they spread their wisdom from the Nile to the Niger. Then came the Ma'afa, the great disaster. Enslavers made it illegal for Africans to read and write. They were forced to forget all they had learned and taught. They built America from the Hudson to the Potomac, to the Mississippi and beyond. Over 400 years of forgetting, they forgot and forgot that they had forgotten. But that changes today. I will remember for them. I will read for them. I will write for them. I will speak for them and teach for them. I will make certain that they are never forgotten again, for I am the vessel through which my ancestors live, breathe, and do their best work. With your support, we didn't just dream about history. We envisioned history and made it. That's how things are accomplished. Talk is cheap. Anybody can talk. But it's what you do and the records that you leave behind that will influence generations for all time. It's about leaving a legacy that can inspire those left behind, so that when the time comes and someone is in distress, they will pour libation and they will call your name, and they know that you will come to show them how it should be done.
The Nile.
with that, I leave you with the words that the ancestors want you to know, that we are the vessels through which the ancestors breathe, speak, and do their best work. They await your engagement. Thank you all very much for attending Kemet in the Desert and spending your night with us. Be safe. Peace. All right, Oscar, it's all yours, brother.
Thank you, brother.
Take it away.
I'm going to follow with you. Go sit back.
Okay.
Franklin. Thank you. Give our brother, Dr. Renaud, Dr. Thank you again for attending the 12th Annual Kemet Desert Lecture Series. We'll see you next year.